So I'll discuss intersectionality. And intersectionality is a concept from Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. And um, as a lawyer, Williams Crenshaw is interested in the ways that gender and race intersect. And so Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw is an American civil rights advocate and scholar of critical race theory. And she's a professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School. And so in the original essay about intersectionality, what Williams Crenshaw is interested in are the ways that gender and race intersect in cases of labor exploitation and labor law. So the case that Williams Crenshaw uses to discuss intersectionality is the case of Emma DeGaffney. And Emma DeGaffney is a Black American woman who is having difficulty finding a job. And so what she argues is that when women are hired in certain industries, the industries tend to favor white women. And when industries follow affirmative action rules in order to hire African Americans, they tend to hire African American men. So Emma Gaffney then can't find a job, and she argues then that when you experience the intersections of both sexism and racism, you might not be counted within affirmative action law, so that affirmative action will count how many women are hired, but all of the women could be white women, and affirmative action will count how many African Americans or Black Americans are hired, and they could all be men. So what then happens if you are a African American or Black woman or woman of color? So this is what Williams Crenshaw is interested in when discussing the concept intersectionality, that when multiple oppressions intersect, people who experience two forms of marginality or potential discrimination within the labor force might not be hired at all. So what this then demonstrates is that affirmative action actually ends up really working for people who are the most privileged people in any category. So it really doesn't address issues of systemic discrimination, and it creates a labor force, and specifically in certain industries, it creates certain industries that are still only representative of very privileged people. From a philosophical perspective, it might create an industry where people have actually very conservative views, and they might actually not really be sympathetic to marginality. So if we think about the ways that race intersects with eugenics, which is something I've discussed previously, then we can think about intersectionality from the perspective of Indigenous rights. So the sterilization of Indigenous women and girls in Canada is specifically about the ways that genocide affects women who are part of ethnic groups that are being actively policed and criminalized. So Indigenous women and girls then are likely to experience forms of intersectional violence as women and also as Indigenous people. So the law then really needs to account for this kind of duality. And this is also true of all forms of intersectionality. So women with disabilities might not be treated in the same manner, or might not have the same success in obtaining jobs or graduate level funding as men with disabilities. So intersectionality is really about these intersections. and about how counting people as being part of one category will mean that the people who are kind of counted are sometimes the most privileged people who are part of this marginalized category. So there are three ideas I will discuss: intersectionality, structural political representation, then I'll discuss the suppression of Black feminist thought, and finally I'll discuss Black feminist standpoint theory, which is a concept and a book by Patricia Hill Collins. So firstly, intersectionality. So there are different types of intersectionality that Crenshaw discusses, and intersectionality is not just about hiring practices. So in the original essay written by Kimberlé Crenshaw, intersectionality is just about work and labor and money. And it is really a legal issue. So as a lawyer and a legal scholar, Kimberlé Crenshaw is interested in this problem of employment, that if employment equity and affirmative action is really supposed to help marginalized people, then why are Black women consistently unemployed or underemployed despite having higher education? And how can these matters really be addressed? Because what employers will do is to simply hire the most privileged people. And I guess it is just a question also, I think, of class antagonism, that when somebody is, say, privileged in one way, it might mean that they have more financial capital. So their interview skills and their curriculum vitae might be more professional than somebody who experiences multiple forms of marginality. They might also have more friends and social capital. So if somebody is privileged in one way but not another, they still might have friends or a network of people who will help them get a job. And this is not necessarily true for people who experience multiple forms of oppression. It is also just about, say, we could argue that if somebody is privileged in one way, it allows, say, the person who is making the hiring decision to think about themselves. So if someone is a man, but they're also a person of color, then if the hiring committee is all white men, they can still think about themselves. This could also be true of privileges of race. So if you are marginalized in one way, but not another, someone could still then think about their own kind of class or group of people whom they're used to being exposed to. So structural intersectionality is something that Crenshaw discusses, and Kimberlé Crenshaw has produced a lot of academic scholarship about intersectionality and all of the ways that it is useful. So structural intersectionality refers to the ways that institutions like shelters for people fleeing from domestic violence are often still places that use a discourse of single issue oppression. So when this set of institutions thinks about domestic violence, they might still think about domestic violence for only one group of women, and specifically say cisgender heterosexual women. And this means that other people who need to use shelter services or are fleeing from intimate partner violence might not be treated in the same way, or they might not feel as though these services are for them. So Crenshaw writes, I observed the dynamics of structural intersectionality during a brief field of study of battered women's shelters located in minority communities in Los Angeles. In most cases, the physical assault that leads women to these shelters is merely the most immediate manifestation of the subordination they experience. Many women who seek protection are unemployed or underemployed, and a good number of them are poor. So class is also interesting to think about, that when someone is working class, but also a woman, and also say a person of color, then how do all of these intersections work in their lives? And is it possible for them to feel as though institutions are inclusive of them or represent them? So, immigrant women are a group of people that Crenshaw then is interested in thinking about from the perspective of the law and as a legal scholar. Immigrant women are also vulnerable to spousal violence because so many of them depend on their husbands for information regarding their legal status. Many women who are now permanent residents continue to suffer abuse under threats of deportation by their husbands. Even if the threats are unfounded, women who have no independent access to information will still be intimidated by such threats. This kind of idea of being under threat is also about intersectional violence, that someone who is under threat doesn't really feel as though anyone will advocate for them. And so when immigrant women try to leave spousal abuse, they're perceived of, on the one hand, as women, but the problem is, in many instances that Crenshaw discusses, because they're immigrants, people see it as a burden to offer them care. And there are a whole set of questions about linguistic diversity in the shelter system and in the healthcare system that are raised. Um, there are also sometimes people who are then sent to uh, people who are also immigrants who expect them to abide by a set of codes and religious norms, which mean that they don't complain about spousal abuse or violence. So rather than having legal rights, they are often thought to be religious subjects who should not use the modern law. So Crenshaw writes, women of color occupy positions both culturally and physically marginalized within dominant society, and so information must be targeted directly to them in order to reach them. Accordingly, rape crisis centers must earmark more resources for basic information dissemination in communities of color than in white ones. So the kind of information that's even available within immigrant communities is really less than what would be available in the general population. So many people who are immigrants might not even be aware of the kind of services that they are actually paying taxes for. Because when they immigrate, they often become part of an enclosed ethnic community, and they don't necessarily receive proper information about what is available to them. And so if immigrant women are part of this enclosed ethnic community, then the only kind of information they receive is as wives and mothers, often of men who are part of the labor force. And so this kind of lack of access to information means that leaving abusive partners and families is really difficult. So it's possible even in cities today throughout the global north for there to be communities of immigrants whom people don't really speak to unless they are also part of an immigrant community. And the problem from a feminist perspective and a legal perspective for Williams Crenshaw is that in cases of domestic violence and spousal abuse, there is no kind of external person who can objectively observe what is violence, and there's often a whole language of religion and culture used to manage things like spousal abuse, child neglect, economic coercion, child physical abuse, sexual abuse, rape, honor-related violence, forced marriage. All of these terms are legal terms, but there is a whole other lexicon of language that is used to justify abuse using a language of religion or culture. So Williams Crenshaw then discusses political intersectionality, and political intersectionality refers to political participation and the ways the political participation is often informed by intersections of gender and race and class. And this is obviously clear. The last US election was full of intense debates and often a lot of highly ideological media regarding citizenship and race. The concept of political intersectionality highlights the facts that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. Racism, as experienced by people of color who are of a particular gender, male, tends to determine the perimeters of anti-racist strategies, just as sexism, as experienced by women who are of a particular race, white, ground the women's movement. So the problem is, from an intersectional perspective, is that when one then tries to advocate for themselves as part of a social movement, then a lot of social movements only speak in the language of the most privileged person who is part of a minority group. The problem is not simply that these discourses fail women of color by not acknowledging the additional issues, race, or of patriarchy, but that the discourses are often inadequate. So the inadequacy is really about not necessarily understanding the kinds of issues that people are trying to discuss. So if we were to think about the anti-racist movement as being predominantly a movement that discusses issues that concern cisgender heterosexual men of color, then there are a whole set of other issues like spousal violence, domestic violence, lack of queer visibility that are also more important in the lives of, say, queer people of color, or transgender people of color, or women of color. So if we think about this from the perspective of the rights of two-spirit people and women who are indigenous, and girls who are indigenous, and transgender and non-binary people who are indigenous, then what constitutes indigenous issues will obviously change depending upon gender identity and other intersecting oppressions. Try to share my screen. I don't know if it will work. Still having problems showing clips. Oh wow. I've been told that IT services would adjust it, but maybe by Thursday can. So the other concept that Crenshaw discusses is representational intersectionality, and this question of representation is also something that Patricia Hill Collins discusses extensively in her book Black Feminist Thought. And Hill Collins is interested in controlling images and the way that images often have a controlling effect on on the ways that societies imagine people who experience intersectional forms of oppression. Representational intersectionality refers to an analysis of what might be termed representational intersectionality and would include these images that are produced through a confluence of race and gender, as well as recognition of how racist and sexist representation marginalize women of color. So this argument is really also about the media and the ways that the media construct images of women of color. And we've discussed the case of Cindy Gladue, which is one of many examples of the media's misrepresentation of Indigenous women and of the murder of Indigenous women. And representational violence is just as important, or it exists alongside and normalizes other forms of violence like police violence and structural discrimination. So the use of the media then creates a discourse in which the erasure of certain people's subjectivity, their rights, even their feelings is normalized through mainstream media. And this is something that Hill Collins also discusses in the book Black Feminist Thought. So in the book Black Feminist Thought, sociologist Hill Collins discusses the term controlling images, and controlling images, writes Hill Collins, result from binary oppositional thinking that emphasizes and then reinforces differences among social groups. Such thinking implies superiority and inferiority in social relationships, leading to the objectification and domination of one group over another. Oppositional binary thinking, as reported by Collins, leads society to devalue Black women due to the cult of true womanhood. Society thus upholds white middle-class women as a symbol of purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity. Black women, on the other hand, have to grapple with many controlling images, and there are 5 that Hill Collins discusses in her book. Firstly, the mammy, the matriarch, the welfare mother, the black lady, and the Jezebel. So these images are historical in nature, and it's interesting to think about from a perspective of Indigenous studies, to think about how these images of Black women and images that go back to the history of slavery are also connected to settler colonialism. So Afua Cooper is a historian and an African-Canadian historian, and Afua Cooper has written extensively about slavery in Canada. So the history of slavery in Canada is obviously connected to the history of settler colonialism and the kind of construction of the bourgeoisie of Canada as being capable of settling land and then finding people who would be forced labor to work the land is central to the history of colonialism. So the first trope, or the first image or set of ideas that Hill Collins argues construct Black women in negative ways is the idea of the mammy. So the controlling image of the mammy characterizes Black women as servants who work at other people's homes and who epitomize obedience and faithfulness to the white family. And there are many images of Black women and also immigrant women who work in other people's homes. And the problem with these images is that they often construct Black women and immigrant women and women of color as being people who are not working but who are doing kind of care labor because of a genuine care and interest in caring for someone else's children and family. So the Live-In Caregiver program is a program that exists in Canada, and historically it has recruited women from different parts of the world, like the Philippines, to work as nannies in really affluent Canadian family homes. So Toronto is a good example. Toronto is home to some of the richest Canadian families. And this live-in caregiver program was discussed by Austin Clarke, who is a Caribbean writer. And in its original inception, women were recruited from the Caribbean to be nannies in predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian homes. So they would take care of people's children and were maids and domestic laborers. This then turned into recruitment programs of women from the Philippines. In every instance, there have been legal cases of sexual harassment of these women, rape, um, refusal to pay them properly, and discrimination because of race. Um, there have also been endless legal questions about their rights from the perspective of immigration and citizenship. So the caregiver program then turned into this program where many women were recruited as migrant women from Asia, and they could stay temporarily, but they could not have their own children. And after contributing a certain amount of years even to taking care of someone else's children, they couldn't stay and become citizens of Canada. So the program was called into question for its implicit hierarchies of gender and race. And so what is implicit in this kind of labor exploitation is a hierarchy of whose personal life, whose family, and whose uh, Canadian citizenship is privileged more than others. So the mammy stereotype then extends to different forms of labor exploitation. The second trope that Hill Collins discusses, which the author argues affects Black women, is the matriarch. So the myth of Black matriarchy was popular among Black nationalist circles, and the matriarch refers to the idea that Black families headed by unmarried mothers caused rather than resulted from poverty and concentrated disadvantages that envelops most of Black America. So Hill Collins argues that the Black matriarchy thesis emerged as tensions began to arise between the mid-20th century feminist and civil rights movements. Since Black mothers worked, unlike their white middle-class counterparts, the matriarch failed to embody true femininity and instead stood too strong relative to underemployed and unemployed Black men. This imagery therefore exacerbates gender relations in Black communities due to the insistence that the structural inequalities that present Black women a means to more consistently support their families financially amounts to a cultural deficit. So there was this dual denigration of Black women as workers and as mothers. And one can see this as a form of ultimate class antagonism, that Black working class women were not seen to be capable of running a household. But the idea of matriarchy itself, of women who wanted to work outside the home but also had to work while also taking care of their children, was the ultimate form of, I would argue, sexism. So what was essentially being said from the perspective of both class antagonism and sexism is that if you are not married to someone who is rich, then you will not be a good mother because you will have to work and also take care of your children. So the only women who can then, again, have children and have successful families must be married to rich men, and specifically affluent white men. So the matriarch stereotype then was seen in all forms of film and media, and also in television shows, specifically television talk shows that often presented Black women as being women who emasculated men and who were seen to be too strong or too loud or aggressive. And hardworking Black mothers, writes Hill Collins, therefore emasculated Black men, as they failed to embody the passivity of the mammy. So the mammy stereotype then is connected to this image of the matriarch because ultimately it goes back to this idea of slavery and labor exploitation. So much like the live-in caregiver program, which involved trying to deport women who had their own children and were supposed to take care of white Canadian families, this kind of matriarch was used to kind of again glamorize the idea of servitude and slavery. So rather than having one's own family and one's own working class family, someone should be happy taking care of someone else's children. So the belief that Black mothers behaving badly explained economic disadvantage got legitimized by the federal government in the 1965 Moynihan Report. Thus, this controlling image brings together the intersections of class, gender, and race to explain away the true causes of oppression in the US. So this kind of exploitation it's really about the ultimate form of class antagonism, that white families want someone to work for them and take care of their children and do their laundry, and they don't want these people to have their own lives. So it is just really a clear case of labor exploitation, that if it was possible for someone to just have 24-hour a day labor to take care of themselves and their own needs, perhaps they would. But we do have comprehensive labor laws in Canada, as well as laws against racial and gender-based discrimination. So the third stereotype that affects Black women is also the welfare mother. And this is something Hill Collins discusses, specifically the time that the welfare mother comes on screen in North American television and on film corresponds with the dissolution of the social welfare state and the rise of neoliberalism. So in the 1960s and 70s in America and Canada, there's a real strong support for the feminist and civil rights movement and for a social welfare state model that often involves housing subsidies, educational subsidies. This changes in the 1980s and 1990s when there's a turn to conservative leadership and conservative capitalism. So this kind of turn to conservative capitalism makes it really difficult for someone who does not have a rich family to survive without social assistance. The problem is that when Black women and Black mothers try to collect benefits, they are often stigmatized. So the imagery against the supposed welfare mother that exists in television talk shows and in the US media characterizes poor working class Black mothers as responsible for the diminishing quality of life in the contemporary capitalist society as a whole. According to Collins, this perception of Black women extends all the way back to slavery, related to an image of Black women as breeders for the labor force of plantation owners. So there is a long history of slavery that informs this refusal to treat Black women well. So from a historical perspective, what someone would say, obviously, who thinks about colonialism critically, is that you can colonize entire sections of the population, steal from them, enslave them, and then then turn them into people who have to supposedly compete fairly for everything. So, and then when they can't succeed, you can obviously say horrible things about them and their family and their children. So this is really how class antagonism works, that one class of people, the ruling class, consistently tries to oppress entire sections of the population, enslave them, steal from them, and then turn them into people who are exploited. And if one is not happy with their exploitation, they can be called a whole host of names. And you can see this, the television talk show genre in America was full of kind of really aggressive and horrible people attacking people of color, and specifically Black women and Indigenous women who ask for any social assistance after colonialism and even during ongoing forms of colonialism, settler colonialism. This idea of meritocracy is used to kind of suggest that we all have to compete fairly and should compete fairly even after someone has stolen so much from others. So this trope encompasses the intersections of race, gender, and class, just like the matriarch. It also shifts blame for contemporary inequality to Black women as a form of social control of their fertility through targeted social welfare policies. So the Black lady is another controlling image that affects Black women in the Americas and throughout the global North. The Black lady centers on the politics of respectability of middle-class Black women in professional careers. So there are these kind of quintessential characters from American television, like Claire Huxtable on The Cosby Show, or the female characters on shows like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which depict an affluent or Black middle-class family. Collins describes this controlling image as a modern mammy because it implicates Black women as working too hard and therefore acting too strong for men to desire them. Additionally, this perception of Black women entering middle-class status leads to resentment of the gendered dimensions of affirmative action. As men came, Black women have taken career opportunities away from them. So again, class antagonism is central to this image of the Black lady, that there is supposedly something that is abnormal about this woman's success, and she will be judged accordingly because of this abnormality. So Black men are often depicted in television talk shows, news media, as people who have to contend with the Black lady who has gained her position in the workplace because white people perceive her as less threatening. And there are all kinds of politics of visual representation in these images of the Black lady. So she is often depicted as being pretty or thin, and her skin color is often discussed in the media. And a good example would be Kamala Harris. And Kamala Harris is an extremely successful lawyer, and she was the vice president of the United States of America. But as soon as she did win the election, she was put on the cover of fashion magazines. Her skin color was discussed, and she was represented as, yes, a lady. And the fact that her mother is part of the Indian diaspora was also used to kind of construct her as being someone who is part of a different kind of dynasty or lineage that has allowed her wealth. And in reality, the country of India is a very poor country. So she had an immigrant mother who's also a woman of color, but still, this construction of her as being a lady was also about her skin color and some imagined privileges she has that other Black people do not have. The Jezebel is the final controlling image that Hill Collins discusses. So the Jezebel relates to Hill Collins' research on the sexuality of Black women. Jezebel operates at the center of the intersections of race, class, gender, and sexuality to characterize Black women as hypersexual and hyper-fertile. So much like the construction of Indigenous women as always being associated somehow with sexuality, with sex work, also with alcohol. This construction of the hypersexual Black women, I would argue, has justified things like the trafficking of women and forcing young girls and women into sex work throughout the Americas. So young Black girls and women in certain states in America have high rates of being forced into sex work when they're under the age of 18. And this is also true of Indigenous girls and women. So this construction of very young women as being hypersexual also justifies sexual harassment and rape. So in the cases that followed the Michael Dobbs ruling, which banned abortion throughout the United States of America, there were several really disturbing cases of young Black girls who were forced to give birth. Um, so the abortion bans obviously intersect with the history of slavery and with anti-Black racism, or what authors call misogynoir. And this kind of hypersexualization of any group of women and girls is often used in courts of law to justify sexual harassment and rape. So controlling images are not just about negative feelings that people that might be produced about a group of people. They're also about the law. So if there are all of these kind of television shows, talk shows, films, music videos, social media sites that construct groups of people in negative ways or present one with really almost cartoonish images of entire sections of the population, then is it possible to commit crimes against these people, and will those crimes be justified because of these images? I would argue in many cases sexual harassment and immediate associations that juries and judges and the public makes when they see certain women and girls can contribute to a lack of fairness in the justice system. And I think this would be true of any group of working class women and girls or people throughout the world, that if the associations are negative and somebody that experiences sexual harassment and rape in a certain city or a certain state, then this can lead to a doubt in a judge or jury's mind. So I've discussed the Michael Dobbs ruling, I think, in previous lectures. So the ruling has challenged comprehensive access to abortion throughout the United States of America. So there are several states in which one cannot access abortion, and Mississippi is one of those states. So after the Michael Dobbs ruling in 2023, a 13-year-old girl in Mississippi gave birth to a boy after she was raped as well as impregnated by a stranger, and then was unable to get an abortion. So one can think about why this happens, and the history of slavery and the history of poverty obviously creates populations of young people who are extremely vulnerable to sexual harassment, to rape. It also creates populations of young people who are more likely to be forced into the drug trade and to the sex trade. So finally, I'll finish by discussing the suppression of Black feminist thought. As I've discussed in previous lectures, a central part of decolonization is challenging how we know things and who we believe to be intelligent and who we believe essentially tells us the truth. And what Indigenous feminist scholars like Joyce Green have discussed are the ways that colonial knowledge production really structures who we think of as not only intelligent, but who we think of as being a person who um, has objective knowledge. And Indigenous feminist scholars have also discussed post-colonial feminism and the relationship between knowledge production and colonization throughout the world. So Joyce Green's book, Making Space for Indigenous Feminism, discusses the importance of Indigenous feminism from the lived perspective of indigeneity, and also from the perspective of activism. And so, similarly, Black feminists like Patricia Williams Crenshaw and like Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins also discuss the importance of Black feminism from an intersectional perspective. So the point from a feminist perspective is as something that is made by many feminist scholars about knowledge production. So knowledge production is discussed by Sandra Harding, and Sandra Harding uses the term epistemic or standpoint epistemology. And epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know things. So what Harding is interested in is how we produce knowledge from a certain perspective. And what interests Harding is how people produce knowledge from the perspective of, say, being the most privileged people. So people who are really rich and, say, of a certain age and live in a certain postcode. And when these people say produce knowledge about Canada, is it relevant to everyone? So if somebody is very affluent and lives in the city of Toronto and has property that they own and no financial problems and is married and can afford to have a live-in caregiver or maid, like, is their perspective about Canada something that is generalizable? Would it make sense to the rest of the population? What Harding argues is that all knowledge is really produced from a certain position, so there is no real objectivity. And Harding argues that feminist theory is just as valuable as any other form of theory, and it is produced from a certain standpoint that centers the lived experiences of people who experience sexism or heterosexism or transphobia. And so Patricia Hill Collins discusses Black feminist standpoint epistemology and thought as being a set of ideas that centers the lived experiences of Black women. So the way that America looks from the perspective of a working class Black transgender woman is obviously really different than how America would be described by someone else. So what Sandra Harding and Hill Collins are interested in discussing as feminist theory is the way that our lived experience and our social location means that we produce certain truth claims. We make certain claims about a good country or a good place to live, or about a certain industry we really enjoy working in because of who we are. Joyce Green has written extensively about the importance of Indigenous feminism and knowledge production. And Green writes that in Canada, since the 1970s, the academic literature has been strengthened by the emergence of a cadre of Aboriginal intellectuals, most of whom were gender blind or hostile to gendered analysis. So, similar to the claims that Black feminists make, or to the analysis that Black feminists have from a legal perspective and also from an academic perspective, there is a similar trend that when Aboriginal scholars emerged in the 1970s, they often talked about Indigenous issues from a gender um, blind or gender neutral perspective that centered the experiences of Indigenous men and ignored the experiences of Two Spirit people and Indigenous women and girls. Green further writes that non-Indigenous scholars began reading these contributions and uncritically accepting the proposition that feminism was inauthentic, un-Aboriginal, and in other ways deeply problematic for Indigenous peoples. So there's again a similarity if we think about the experiences that women, and specifically migrant and immigrant women and women who are part of ethnic communities have, that when feminism is seen as inauthentic to one's supposed ethnic community, then we get back to questions of structural oppression that Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw discusses as a lawyer. When somebody is trying to flee domestic violence, child sexual abuse, physical abuse, and rape, if they are then supposed to be people who are part of an ethnic community that is not feminist in nature, can they flee this violence? Are they supposed to have a language that just allows them to tolerate being abused? And who would want to have this language and why? So Green writes, this led to a consensus in the thinking of scholars and others that feminism was an alien ideology, inimical to the political and cultural objectives of Aboriginal women in particular and Aboriginal peoples in general. In 2002, writes Green, my interest in Aboriginal feminism and the opportunity to focus on it came together. I spent a year at the Saskatchewan Institute of Public Policy and had time to devote organizing, research, and writing. Had time to devote to organizing, to research and writing. The conditions were right for me to organize a symposium by the Aboriginal feminists. It seemed important to bring some of these women together to talk about Aboriginal feminists. The Canadian federal government agency Status of Women Canada had funds available to the community groups to pursue research activities, community building, and similar kinds of tasks. So this kind of work then continues to produce academic books, legal precedents, and reports, of course, like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. But it is still, I think, somewhat controversial, and there is still always this tension between one's supposed understanding and acceptance of cultural rules and cultural ideology as opposed to legal claims from a feminist perspective. And what I would argue is that this kind of tension is ultimately about class antagonism. That when people have legal claims to make of spousal violence, domestic violence, child neglect, child abuse, there are also claims that are about class and one's right as, say, a person who lives in Canada or a person who claims residency in Canada to have a set of legal rights that allow someone to independently access education, work, housing, irrespective of their relationship to a cisgender heterosexual family. So Hill Collins also discusses the ways that Black feminist thought was suppressed historically. Hill Collins writes, Afro-American women have long been privy to some of the most intimate secrets of white society. Countless numbers of Black women have ridden buses to their white families, where they not only cooked, cleaned, and executed domestic duties, but where they also nurtured their other children, shrewdly offered guidance to their employers, and frequently became honorary members of their white families. These women have seen white elites, both actual and aspiring, from perspectives largely obscured from their Black spouses and from these groups themselves. So the history of domestic labor is really interesting, and the history of domestic labor and race and gender is similar in Canada. That Austin Clarke's writing documents the history of Caribbean women and predominantly Afro-Caribbean women who worked as caregivers in Canadian homes, and this kind of uh, servitude then turned into programs like the Live-In Caregiver Program and the recruitment of women from the Philippines and other parts of Asia who also worked as servants in Canadian homes. In spite of the obstacles that can confront outsiders within, such individuals can benefit from this status. Simmel's essay on the sociological significance of what he called the stranger offers a helpful starting point for understanding the largely unexplored area of Black female outsiders within status and the usefulness of the standpoint it might produce. So, George Simmel is a sociologist and was really interested in the idea of the outsider and the kind of knowledge that the outsider would produce about a society. And authors like Hill Collins, then, as a sociologist, is interested in the ways that this kind of figure of the outsider, in the essay The Stranger, is useful to think about how the kind of good, supposedly good middle class family appears from the perspective of the outsider. So The Stranger is this essay written by Simmel, who discusses the stranger as a unique sociological category. He differentiates the stranger both from the outsider, who has no specific relation to a group, and from the wanderer, who comes today and leaves tomorrow. The stranger, he says, comes today and stays tomorrow. So the stranger is not really an immigrant or someone who is a tourist or visiting. The stranger is someone who's part of a society, but still exists on the outskirts of a society. Even though they have a relationship to mainstream society, they still stand at a distance from it. And the ways that the stranger interacts with the familiar family in the writing of Hill Collins, often through this history of live-in care or servitude or nanny status. There are also a whole other series of professions that specifically often involve Black women caring for the children of white middle-class women in the Americas. So some of the potential benefits of outsider status, and this is what's interesting about Simmel's essay, is that he argues that being an outsider actually has a lot of potential benefits from the perspective of sociology. And if one thinks about a critical distance from the mainstream, then it is possible to produce a certain amount of knowledge about a society. It is also possible to stand at a distance from very privileged people and to think about their lives critically. So some of the potential benefits of outsider within status include George Simmel's definition of objectivity as the peculiar composition of nearness and remoteness, concern and indifference. The tendency for people to confide in a stranger in ways they never would with each other. The ability of the stranger to see patterns that may be more difficult for those immersed in the situation to see. it's interesting to think about George Simmel's idea of the stranger and Hill Collins' work in relation to a lot of scholarship that has been produced in the last, I'd say, 10, 15 years by queer people of color and transgender people of color. So the ways that the kind of gendering of people's bodies and the a kind of force of Christian family values appears from the outsider, or from the perspective of the stranger, allows one to think critically about things like cisnormativity and heteronormativity as also being connected to settler nation building and Christianization of the population. Mannheim labels the strangers in academia marginal intellectuals and argues that the critical posture such individuals bring to academic endeavors may be essential to the creative development of academic disciplines themselves. So the knowledge production of Joyce Green, as who writes about Indigenous gender roles and feminism, is a form of kind of intellectual production that often exists on the margins of single issue canons. So single issue canons, much like single issue politics, often think about political issues from the perspective of the most privileged people. So if we were to think about Marxism, Marxist scholarship would be produced by only the most kind of privileged working class people, namely people who are privileged in every other way except for their class position. This is also true of feminism, which Green argues historically was only written from the perspective of the most privileged Canadian settlers. So marginal intellectuals then occupy this position of a stranger who is also someone who is part of an institution. Finally, in assessing the potentially positive qualities of social difference, specifically marginality, Lee notes, quote, "For a time, this marginality can be a most stimulating, albeit often painful experience. For some, it is debilitating. For others, it is an excitement to creativity." So Hill Collins is interested in the exploitation of Black women's labor and the ways that Black women's labor exploitation often is central to how knowledge production is controlled by the most elite people in society. First, the exploitation of Black women's labor, essential to U.S. capitalism, the iron pots and kettles, symbolizing Black women's long-standing ghettoization and service occupations, represents the economic dimension of oppression. Survival for most African American women has been such an all-consuming activity that most have had few opportunities to do intellectual work as it has been traditionally defined. The drudgery of enslaved African American women's work and the grinding poverty of free-wage labor in the rural South tellingly illustrates the high costs of Black women have paid for survival. So central to labor exploitation and even slavery was the construction of a whole host of really negative ideas. So when you complain about, I guess, sexual harassment or never being paid, you can be called a bitch. And this is a way that I guess people can continue to sexually harass you or never pay you. Secondly, the political dimension of oppression has denied African American women the rights and privileges routinely extended to white male citizens. Forbidding Black women to vote, excluding African Americans and women from public office, and withholding equitable treatment in the criminal justice system all substantiate the political subordination of Black women. Educational institutions have also fostered this pattern of disenfranchisement. Past practices such as denying literacy to slaves and relegating Black women to underfunded, segregated schools worked to ensure equality education for Black women remain the exception rather than the rule. Large numbers of young Black women in inner cities and impoverished rural areas who continue to leave school before attaining full literacy represent the continued efficacy of the political dimension of Black women's oppression. Finally, controlling images applied to Black women that originated during the slave era attested to the ideological dimensions of the U.S. Black women's oppression. Ideology refers to the body of ideas reflecting the interests of a group of people. Within U.S. culture, racist and sexist ideologies permeate the social structure to such a degree that they become hegemonic, namely seen as natural, normal, inevitable. And I would argue in Canada this is also true, and settler colonialism in Canada has normalized violence against Indigenous women and other groups of people who, to the point that Bradley Barton is not named as a white man, even after he murders Cindy Gladue. And Cindy Gladue, even after she is dead, is called a, quote, native prostitute. So she is put on trial after she is dead and after he has killed her, but he is never implicated with any hostility as a white settler man and white settler murderer. From the Mammies, Jezebel, and breeder women of slavery to the smiling Aunt Jemimas on pancake mix boxes, ubiquitous Black prostitutes, and ever-present welfare mothers of contemporary popular culture, negative stereotypes applied to African American women have been fundamental to Black women's oppression. So even after death, George Floyd was referred to as a man with fake currency. So when you die, even when you die, you can be put on trial after you are dead. So the person who has killed you is not guilty of murder. And this is obviously how controlling images work to normalize extreme crimes against minorities, including murder. The same is true in all cases of rape historically. So lawyers throughout the US and Canada have consistently shown how when women complain of sexual harassment and rape, the clothing they were wearing, their consumption of alcohol can be used to put people on trial who are actually victims of crime and to exonerate those who have committed crimes. So finally, in the last 5 minutes, I will discuss self-definition and self-valuation. And this idea of self-esteem is central to Black feminist thought and intellectual production for Hill Collins and Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. An affirmation of the importance of Black women's self-definition and self-valuation is the first key theme that pervades historical and contemporary statements of Black feminist thought. Self-definition involves challenging the political knowledge validation process that has resulted in externally defined stereotypical images of African American womanhood. So self-definition is also central to the creation of alternative media, artistic work, books, economies that promote positive images of Black femininity. Indigeneity as a form of scholarship and the construction of Indigenous feminism as a body of knowledge has also produced a whole series of texts, artists like Rebecca Belmore, who I've mentioned previously, who was the first Indigenous woman to represent Canada at the Venice Biennale, and scholars like Joyce Green, who has produced a whole series of texts and symposiums and conferences, and all of these kind of alternative forms of cultural production offer spaces and sets of ideas and a language to promote positive self-valuation for Black women and girls, and for Indigenous women and girls. While Black Female self-definition speaks to the power dynamics involved in the act of defining images of self and community. The theme of Black female self-evaluation addresses the actual content of these self-definitions. Many of the attributes extant in Black female stereotypes are actually distorted renderings of those aspects of Black female behavior seen as most threatening to white patriarchy. For example, aggressive Afro-American women are threatening because they challenge white patriarchal definitions of femininity. To ridicule assertive women by labeling them sapphires reflects an effort to put all women in their place, in their role as central figures in socializing the next generation of Black adults. Strong mothers are similarly threatening because they contradict patriarchal views of family power relations. To ridicule strong Black mothers by labeling them matriarchs reflects a similar effort to control another aspect of Black female behavior that is especially threatening to the status quo. So the idea of the mother and the matriarch is something that is constantly critiqued and ridiculed throughout the history of the Americas. And this is also interesting from the perspective of Indigenous issues in Canada, that matrifocal lines of inheritance are often mocked, and women who are the central, say, economic earners and authority figures are often degraded within North American media and popular culture. Black women's insistence on self-definition, self-valuation, and the necessity for a Black female-centered analysis is significant for two reasons. First, defining and valuing one's consciousness of one's own self-defined standpoint in the face of images that foster a self-definition as the objectified other is an important way of resisting the dehumanization essential to systems of domination. The status of being the other implies being other than, or different from the assumed norm of white male behavior. In this model, powerful white males define themselves as subjects, as true actors that classify people of color and women in terms of their position vis-a-vis this white male hub. And so this takes us back to the case of Cindy Gladue and Bradley Barton. And Cindy Gladue, who is referred to over 50 times in courts of law as, quote, a native prostitute, and Bradley Barton, who is never referred to as a white man. And we see similar patterns of behavior emerge in the normalization of white male violence and the kind of spectacle of Black women's supposed threats to patriarchy. Since Black women have been denied the authority to challenge these definitions, this model consists of images that define Black women as a negative other, the virtual antithesis of positive white male images. Moreover, as Britton and Maynard point out, domination always involves the objectification of the dominated. All forms of oppression imply the devaluation of the subjectivity of the oppressed. Psychological oppression is central to the ways that Black feminist thought and self-evaluation is difficult, but requires a challenging of the pathologization of Black women's intellectual production and feelings. A second reason that Black female self-definition and self-valuation are significant concerns, their value in allowing African American women to reject internalized psychological oppression. And Hill Collins cites James Baldwin, who sees the rejection of internalized psychological oppression as central to Black American politics. and is central to the development of North America as a functioning set of states and countries and a functioning place to live. The potential damage of internalized control to African American women's self-esteem can be great, even to the prepared. Enduring the frequent assaults of controlling images requires considerable inner strength. Nancy White, cited earlier, also points out how debilitating being treated as less than human can be if Black women are not self-defined. She notes, quote, "Now you know that no woman is a dog or a mule, but if folks keep making you feel that way, if you don't have a mind of your own, you can start letting them tell you what you are." Seen in this light, self-definition and self-valuation are not luxuries. They are necessary for Black female survival. So we only have 5 minutes left, so I'll finish just by discussing some more points, which I've already kind of mentioned from this text, Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. And it is a foundational text in feminist theory. So if you were to do a law degree or master's degree, it is one of the most widely cited texts when thinking about the ways that intersectional violence affects cases of labor exploitation, sexual harassment, asylum and citizenship claims. And also, if you do a master's degree, it's also central to the study of feminist thought and sociology. So in this text, Hill Collins draws, as I mentioned, on Sandra Harding, who provides a useful definition of Eurocentrism that parallels the use of Hill Collins' term. Western or Eurocentric social and political thought contains 3 interrelated approaches to ascertaining truth that are routinely portrayed as competing epistemologies. The first, reflected in positivist science, has long claimed that absolute truth exists and that the task of scholarship is to develop objective, unbiased tools of science to measure these truths. But many social theories have challenged the concept of epistemology of this version of science as representing the vested interests of elite white men, and therefore as being less valid when applied to experiences of other groups, and more recently to white male scholars. The second approach, earlier versions of standpoint theories that were themselves rooted in a Marxist positivism, essentially reversed positivist science's assumptions concerning whose truth would prevail. These approaches suggest that the oppressed allegedly have a clearer view of truth than their oppressors, because they lack the blinders created by the dominant group's ideology. This kind of idea of the truth is also about norms and about history. So from the perspective of, say, the most privileged people or the kind of most normative or mainstream society, Bradley Barton is just Bradley Barton. The fact that he is a white man does not seem strange to juries and judges. From the perspective of people who are not white or not male, the fact that Bradley Barton did this to Cindy Gladue is really abnormal. I mean, his contact with her and his extreme violence against her as a white man is worthy of mention, and the history of white men colonizing other people and abusing others and enslaving and forcing others into sex work is quite noteworthy in the history of colonialism throughout the world, including in India, including in Latin America. So this version of standpoint theory duplicates the positive belief in one true interpretation of reality, and like positivist science, comes with its own set of problems. Postmodernism, the third approach, has been forwarded as the antithesis and the inevitable outcome of rejecting positivist science. Within postmodern logic, groups themselves become suspect, as well as any specialized thought. So postmodernism critiques this idea of modern truth as universal. So in the idea of, say, modernism, we are all essentially people who have the same rights and the same privileges. The problem is postmodernism would then look at the ways that historically we don't all really actualize these rights. And obviously, we don't respect each other's rights because of historical markers like gender or sexuality or race or religion or class. Within in extreme postmodern discourse, each group's thought is equally valid. No group can claim to have a better interpretation of the truth than another. In a sense, postmodernism represents the opposite of scientific ideologies of objectivity. So what the case of Cindy Gladue, or the murder of Cindy Gladue, looks like from a postmodern perspective is not one set of ideas or objective truth. It will look really different depending upon who you are in Canada, or who you are in relation to the history of settler colonialism in Canada. No homogeneous Black woman's standpoint exists, writes Hill Collins. There is no essential or archetypal Black woman whose experiences stand as normal, normative, and thereby authentic. An essentialist understanding of Black women's standpoint suppresses differences among Black women in search of an exclusive group unity. Instead, it may be more accurate to say that a Black woman's collective standpoint does exist, one characterized by the tensions that accrue to different responses to common challenges. So here, Hill Collins reflects the work of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who discusses the term strategic essentialism. So what Spivak argues is there's nothing about being, say, a woman or being a person of color that makes me the same as someone else. We all have different experiences. We all don't agree. But there are experiences like, say, sexual harassment that mean that I might support the Me Too movement as a woman. So there are these times when essential markers of identity are strategically mobilized. So two people who identify as queer might have nothing in common. But when there are policies in place that threaten a queer person's right to marry, then all queer people might agree that this is a fundamental right and we have something in common as people who can mobilize our identity. So finally, I will finish with this quote by Toni Morrison. The function of freedom is to free someone else. And I would argue that Black feminist thought has done a great deal, specifically Williams Crenshaw, Kimberlé Crenshaw's later work about the treatment of immigrant women and women seeking asylum has been really important in thinking about the ways that intersectional oppression does not allow people to claim basic rights anywhere in the world. And this is a problem that can be and has to be addressed in international law. So that is the lecture. Sorry it went so late. There's not that much time for discussion. Do you have any questions about the lecture or the test? Yes, you can make reference to either the articles or the lectures or both. So I think the intersectionality is really interesting to consider, and it's interesting because of the time. Like in the 80s, Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw wrote specifically about Black women, but a lot of her most recent scholarship, or more recent scholarship as a lawyer and legal scholar, has been about immigrant women who are citizens and are permanent residents, but are still often people who whose intersectional oppression is not really understood in cases in law and in cases specifically of domestic violence. a lot of immigrant women um, are not necessarily people who are seen to be community leaders, and they're not necessarily then people who can actualize their rights in cases of spousal abuse. You can use the author date system if it's author date system, which is Chicago, MLA. So you would put there's an entry actually on the RDP website, which will explain. Yeah, it's right here. So the guide is here. So all the information is in this guide, which is right here. Okay, so I'll end the class there because I teach a class shortly after this. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your test answers. Thanks. Bye.